One can compare a universe to a cup of coffee. Most of it is, of course, coffee. This is the dark energy. This is what science has been all about for thousands of years, up until now.
Hi, hello, and welcome to Coffee Literature Review. I'm Chris Hendon. As always, I'm joined by Doran Pennington, and our guest for today is Kim Elena Ionescu. Today, we're going to be talking about an article published in the Journal of Retailing and Consumer Services. This is a little outside of the zone of what Doran and I usually work in. This article was published in the year 2022, and it's titled Explaining the Willingness of Consumers to Bring Their Own Reusable Cups Under the Condition of Monetary Incentives. How much money do I need to pay my consumer of my coffee to bring a reusable cup? There's a bit of a challenge in there because it's basically stating that in order for someone to use a reusable cup, we need to pay them. Perhaps that's not exactly the reason people are using reusable cups. We're going to get into all that, and we're going to do it with Kim. Hey, Kim, how's it going?
Good. How are you?
We're really good. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm going to give a truncated version of your career. You bought coffee for Counterculture, green coffee for 12 years. And then also, you're now the Chief Sustainability and Knowledge Development Officer for the Specialty Coffee Association.
Yeah.
You have a serious microphone.
Well, I do. This was actually, there was a short period where SCA had a couple of podcasts, and one of my enthusiastic comms colleagues sent me this microphone, which I have not had many occasions to use, but I've got the whole setup. So who knows where this is going to go? Yeah. Islands in the stream. Yeah.
When I gave you this paper and I spoke to you at the SCA, I was a little worried that it was going to be bad. And then I read this paper and I'm actually like thinking it's not bad.
Oh yeah. You pitched me on this saying it was boring.
Well, like the late great Jerry Orbach said at the end of Dirty Dancing, when I'm wrong, I say I'm wrong.
No, it wasn't boring. Although it also didn't tell me a lot that surprised me.
Let me start by asking you first that when you transitioned from buying green coffee to this role in the SCA, which at the time was the director of sustainability.
Yes.
What's the link there? It's you had an interest in green coffee in the supply chain, or how did you go that way?
Yeah, the two interests actually developed at the same time, like exactly the same time. Because when I started working for Counterculture, I actually worked more on the retail side, like more relevant to what we're going to talk about today with the article. I was a customer relations person, and I worked with grocery stores, like natural foods chains. And I was really interested in what was happening on the buying side. And I sort of pitched myself as a customer relations manager, but for producer relationships. Like what would it be like if we put that same amount of time into being a good buyer as we put into being a good vendor to our customers? And Counterculture basically said, that sounds cool. At the same time that you do that, could you also be responsible for sustainability? Because we have a commitment to that in our vision statement, but nobody is actively managing it or working on it. So I became a producer relations and sustainability manager in 2007. So from there, I started the green buying thing came from the producer relationship manager job, and the sustainability job kind of grew along the way. So I was always interested in both of those things and kind of doing them simultaneously.
So I've heard you speak about lots of different things, so RECO symposiums over the years, also lectures that you've given. And even watched some recordings, and we just found I think a Wall Street Journal piece on you with an amazing photo of you standing on a coffee bag, which by the way was really, really good.
Holding my backpack, yeah.
Because you have this role, right? You've done the intros at the RECO symposia, excuse me, and you're thinking about knowledge development and dissemination. I mean, like, what is knowledge?
A lot of what we're talking about at SCA when we talk about knowledge is research, but taken from its sort of raw form, which might be like a scientific journal article, and then packaged in a way that it's relevant to the audience. And in our case, the audience is usually coffee industry professionals from one group or another, or one geographic region or another. So we could call it like I'm the research development or research and development officer, but knowledge does take a bunch of different forms. It becomes the curriculum for our education programs, or the programs for events like RECO, or the Educator Summit. And it also becomes articles for our Journal 25 and for SCA News and for other dissemination channels as well. So it ends up looking a lot of different ways.
So when you think about sustainability and what the big concepts and important movements are, does reusable cups come to the front of your mind, or is that something that you don't really think about?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked because I've had a sustainability title in the coffee industry for 17 years. And I would wager that anyone who's ever worked in coffee retail has faced questions about paper cups and what we can do about the problem that is paper cups. And certainly anyone with a sustainability title has gotten that question a lot of times. So I have been asked about paper cups a lot of times over the years. This paper cup anxiety is, yeah, it's really persistent.
There was a period where we went through, and maybe we're still in that period with plastic single-use straws, and then everyone's thinking about all these consumables. I think the straws is a little more tricky because there's a component you have to think about whether the consumer is able-bodied, and there's a reason
Yeah.
why, so that. But the cup example is pretty unusual because it's one that you need a receptacle to put a liquid in. That's one of the unique properties of a liquid. So let me introduce the paper quickly then. As I mentioned, it's published in the Journal of Retailing and Consumer Services, explaining the willingness of consumers to bring their own reusable coffee cups under the condition of monetary incentives. The general premise of the paper basically is, what do we have to do to get people to use their own reusable cups? But before we dive into that, I want to go for the high level question for you here, Kim. Should people use reusable cups?
Yes.
Okay, good. Yeah, I just want to make sure that sort of we're in the zone here.
Could I ask you a question in return?
Yes.
Should people feel bad if they don't use a reusable cup?
Yeah. Well, so I was actually going to ask you that exact question myself. So since you've asked me and I was going to ask you, so you know what that means.
We ask it together?
No, we asked Doran.
Oh,
I think that it's difficult to put the burden of making this choice on a consumer. I think whenever these are more high level enforced things where it's like there's not even an option, it's like you bring the reusable coffee cup. Like if you want to talk about making people feel bad or not, or incentivizing it or not, my view is that it's kind of a more, institutional thing that needs to filter down kind of from the top. But also, yeah, people should feel a little bad.
Well, if you do a life cycle assessment, you can quickly see, okay, anything that was first grown and required water. So if you had to water the tree that then make the paper that then made the cup, you're going to have a huge environmental impact because water inherently is something it's a resource that costs a lot of money and a lot of energy to produce that. So as a result, inevitably, any process that involves water and multiple steps of transport and blah, blah, blah are going to be negatively impacting the environment. But one thing we should also not forget is that producing a glass cup or a plastic cup that is reusable also has a negative impact on the environment. Like to get silicates to melt, you have to heat it up really, really hot. That costs energy. So to do this properly, you need a life cycle assessment, which they did.
there's actually a study on a life cycle assessment that I went back and found because it made a big impression on me when I first read it as a young sustainability manager in the early 2000s. And it's from 1994, and it was done in Canada, and it compares a styrofoam cup, a paper cup, and a ceramic cup. And it really blew my mind because it was the first time that I had thought about, embodied energy. And it was the first time I thought about the dishwasher. And, I think the number of times that you had to use the ceramic cup was like hundreds or maybe thousands compared to the styrofoam cup. And it just made it much more complex than it ever had been to me before as a user of a cup.
And as you know, right, at the SCA, doing a proper life cycle assessment, a bona fide one that you can really rely on, is extremely, extremely challenging. Like if it's very expensive. Let's do some quick numbers here. So here's something I didn't fully appreciate, that worldwide, 500 billion disposable cups are distributed per year. So 500 billion disposable cups handed out annually. From the life cycle assessment, if you were to switch to any reusable cup, you can cut down the carbon emissions down to 33% of what it was. That's just from the intro of this paper. So there's a very good economic and environmental reason for why you should want to do this. They do in the paper mention polystyrene cups, and in the specialty coffee world, it's, I think, quite rare. But Kim, you can tell me if I'm wrong. Or do people still use styrofoam cups in specialty coffee?
I think it's pretty rare.
Because usually when you think of a styrofoam cup, you usually use it one time, maybe a couple times if you're really being thoughtful, and then you're going to throw it away. And there's not really another thing you do with it, unless you're into making napalm, then, then there's a use.
See, that's outside my expertise,
Yeah.
On the record, off your expertise.
Not my kind of knowledge, let's say it that way.
Yeah. So I was looking through this, and I want to get your thoughts on this. There's two ways that you can think of a monetary incentive to use a reusable cup. On one hand, you can offer a discount to those that bring along a cup, and that is sort of I'd say a carrot. On the other hand, you could offer an elevated price for those that do not bring a cup, and therefore you're basically charging them for the opportunity to use a single-use cup. That's a stick. Talk me through the carrot and the stick situation.
In other studies, under some circumstances, sticks have been found to be more effective at behavior change than carrots when it comes to discounts versus penalties, the same amount. But I think that's looking at it in a vacuum. I can see a bunch of reasons that in that context, framing it as a discount is a lot more appealing than framing it as a penalty for not bringing your reusable cup.
Yeah, I think if you're a customer and you walk into a coffee shop, I mean, ultimately you want to feel better than when you walked in. And so if you walk in and you have the barista say, "Oh, we're going to charge you extra because you didn't bring a cup, it's your fault."
Yeah, the relationship is such an important part of the coffee experience and the coffee shop environment, even if the coffee is being taken to go and not being consumed on premise. And sometimes, at least in the United States, the barista's wage is also kind of dependent on tips, or their livelihood is dependent on tips. And so introducing another, moment of friction with the potential tipper is something that, I wouldn't want to put my staff in the position of having to do.
And they give some examples in this article about like some of the larger chain coffee stores giving a monetary incentive for bringing a reusable cup. But these chain coffee stores also have the market share where they could even produce their own branded versions of the reusable cups. Not well, I'm happen to be drinking out of a specialty coffee branded reusable insulated mug today.
Is that Toby's Estate? I can't read it.
It is Toby's Estate, and it's
right.
one of the Myrrh mugs. So this, I guess you pronounce it Myrrh, or is it Mirror?
I've always heard Mirror.
Mirror. Okay, so and these are becoming more increasingly popular in the specialty community because, of course, they are insulated, so you can have a hot beverage in there or a cold one, and it'll just stay relatively temperature stable. Not the point. The point is what I was trying to say here is that companies like, as they mentioned here, Peet's, Starbucks, Caribou Coffee, they all are large. They're big time companies in specialty coffee and commodity coffee. And when customers walk in there and see the disco ball colored Starbucks cup that is exactly the size that, whatever size that happens to be, and they buy it, and it's now advertising for Starbucks, and they're walking around with it, but they also bring it in, they fill it up, and it's the whole ecosystem. Having a monetary incentive there, I mean, Starbucks is, and other companies like that are getting advertising revenue from that inadvertently because people are holding it outside of the store constantly. But then on the other hand, they point to a specialty coffee company here that was doing the penalty-based 25 cents elevated price. Specialty coffee is a strange one because most people in specialty coffee, I would say, have some knowledge of what sustainability means and what we need to be environmentally cognizant of our decisions and how we purchase coffee and how we drink it. And there's so much to it. And especially coffee enthusiasts and participants are probably more well-trained than your average person. They think about this stuff. This is point one of the paper. If you have any knowledge whatsoever of sustainability, it seems as though you are going to be prepared to pay money. You will make choices that cost money so that you feel good about being more sustainable. And this ranges from the hotels you choose to book yourself into, to the cup that you choose to drink coffee out of, probably to the car you drive. The person who does this in lots of different ways and knows that it costs. Do you think that then the specialty coffee industry is uniquely well suited to be sort of the bastion or the pillar or the guiding light in this push for reusable cups, given the market is trained already to care about this stuff?
Yes and no.
Okay.
Which one do you want first?
Well, I like to finish positive, so hit me with the no.
coffee has sort of an uphill battle here because I perceive a really disproportionate amount of anxiety put on the paper cup, the disposable paper cup versus disposable everything else that we interact with on a
Yeah.
daily basis. You
Yeah.
know, yeah, 500 million paper cups a year is like, that is, nauseating. But I don't know. Can we get a comparable figure of something like, I don't know, plastic wrap packaging, plastic
How about
spoons,
water waste?
water waste, yeah, bubble wrap, apparently really bad for the environment. Like, what are some
Sure.
of the other figures that we have to compare that to? Um, and I think that in like when I look at coffee and when I look at the number of articles in the popular press that are about um the horror of paper cups as a contributor to landfill waste, or, to kind of put coffee anxiety in a different context, the number of people who advise like cutting out coffee as a way to balance your budget. I just see that we have this like really fraught relationship with coffee that I see playing out again. And in this case, on paper cups being the symbol of wastefulness versus, clamshell packaging for sandwiches from the deli or from McDonald's or whatever.
So to go back to the yes, because you gave me
Yes.
the no.
Okay. So that was a no, but I do have a yes, which is that I think that the same thing that makes it hard to frame a like a reusable cup discount as a fee on a paper cup, that sort of relationship based aspect of coffee is one of the things that I think actually does give us an opportunity to shape the conversation, because people really love coffee and they, love the
Yeah.
experience of getting coffee, and they go out of their way in their day to go and get coffee from a specific place of a specific type. And so in that sense, I think that there's a little bit of a room to experiment and to try different things and to see what works.
When we think about these reusable cups, very often I think we are almost implicitly assuming that the reusable cup is one that someone will take to go. I've been to cafes where the mugs that they have at the cafe, they're really thick lipped, and I strongly hate it because I can't quite tell what temperature the liquid's going to be before it just annihilates my face. Okay. So I much prefer a thinner lipped receptacle. And whether it's a to-go cup or not is inconsequential in my point. My point is that this doesn't need to only be about to-go cups. Like, what if a cafe said, hey, you can bring any mug you want. You're welcome to sit here and have it here. And then that made me think, well, but the specialty coffee industry is also about curating a space. It's not only about curating, it's about curating a look. Like, people make choices on the color of the cups they use for lots of different reasons. Whether or not you want to read into the scientific literature on that's inconsequential. But I can also imagine examples where people would worry about that, right? I suspect that probably happens.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up, because in the paper they do note that like drinking your coffee in the cafe with a mug that is belongs to the cafe, that is also a reusable cup. That it isn't just about,
Exactly.
to go culture. And while there are some cafes that sell all of their coffee in paper and don't have a ceramic option because they don't have a dishwasher, or they don't have a
Yeah.
space to store the ceramics. I would say most places still have if they're seating, they have a for here option, and that for here option is inherently a reusable cup. So people are making the decision, or they have like multiple ways in which to make the decision to use a reusable cup.
I'll say one thing. If you and I were to start a cafe, Kim, right now, what would we do about this cup situation? Let's actually think. Like, I've done it in my lab. I said, well, I didn't have a choice because Oregon said that we can't have cups because we're not a vendor. So that's why we made that decision. But what would we do?
I think we would decide on what the culture of our business was going to be. I think that in that way, the cups really, like, there are so many decisions that happen before paper cups come into the equation, because people love to use the example of, espresso in Italy. Like, you don't get
Mm-hmm.
espresso in Italy, like they don't use paper cups. And
You
like,
stand at the
sure, you
bar
stand
and
at the counter and you drink your
yeah.
espresso in the train station, and and that's true. But like, focusing on the cup in that case is totally missing the point, or it's like there's so
Yeah.
many things that happened before it got to the choice of vessel. And I was thinking about our conversation and thinking, okay, what's like a non-coffee example? Not the espresso in Italy. comparison. And I went to another favorite comparison of coffees, which is wine. And, you know, most of the time we're not drinking wine from paper cups. Most of the time, you know,
I've done that lots of times.
most of the time. So I would say that for our shop, we should start with the question of, okay, what kind of like, who's our customer and what kind of space and experience are we trying to create? What are people going to do in our shop? Are they going to come in and, you know, taste a tiny amount of coffee? Are they going to come in and linger? Are they going to, you know, drive through? And all of those things would really dictate what our relationship with paper cup should be.
I'm thinking, so what I heard from you just then is twofold, is that if we do a cafe, we're going to also do wine. And if we do wine, we're going to do
cups.
we're not going to do paper cups. But I mean, I don't understand. Look, wine's already in a bottle. Why even decant it? Let's just go straight. We're doing wine by the bottle, from the bottle.
For sustainability purposes.
Yes, exactly.
Sustainability purposes only, no dishwashing needed.
And then I was thinking about who would we attract if we just did wine from the bottle, by the bottle. And I don't know who that would be.
We should do a pop-up sometime, you know, one of these coffee events.
This raises an interesting point thinking about the audience, because there's an interesting facet to this paper, which is that this survey was conducted through this Amazon thing called Mechanical Turk. And this is like a web-based thing where people can take surveys and get small amounts of money. It's like, you know, $1 for a survey or something like that. But the interesting thing to that is that the people, everybody that's taking this survey is necessarily driven by financial incentives. Otherwise, they wouldn't be spending their time doing this. So whenever you're thinking about how people are responding to financial incentives, as told by the data of this paper, you do have to keep in mind that everyone taking this survey is in some way financially incentivized.
That's true. Okay, it turns out 92% of people want to bring a cup, okay? But the more interesting one is, what is the mean amount in US cents that they need to be compensated? And the mean was 26 cents, but the standard deviation was 28 cents. That doesn't necessarily mean that there was people who were saying, no, I'll pay an extra dollar. There's probably one or two that did that, but it does mean there were people that were prepared to pay money to bring the cup. Doran, so give us the overview of roughly how this went.
Yeah, so this is an interesting paper because their first figure is kind of an outline of their ideas. And in chemistry, you never really see this. So it's pretty interesting to look at, where they're like, these are our specific 4 hypotheses, and these are our specific research questions that we want to answer. And basically what they want to figure out is, does being environmentally conscious in some way positively influence your willingness to use reusable cups? And so they designed some survey questions around this using a Likert scale, which is just, if you've ever seen the survey scale that's like strongly disagree, disagree, somewhat disagree, neutral, up to strongly agree, that's basically what this is. So they asked a bunch of people through Mechanical Turk this question, and their survey size is pretty large. It's over 1,000. And they fit their data to this model, which I haven't seen before, the Hecate model. But they have a mathematical description of that wraps up the variables that go into making a choice and determine if they're correlated or not. So they're trying to figure out if there's a correlation between being environmentally aware and conscious and choosing to use a reusable cup. And then they have data which is mapping all of their survey responses to the specific questions that they ask, and then using this to say, are our hypotheses supported by the respondents of the survey or not?
Kim, did any of the other data in this, let's say table 1 here, jump out at you?
Yeah, I also just think from experience on that one that while a lot of us have reusable cups, the likelihood of having the right reusable cup that is clean in the right place at the right time, you know, in an appropriate setting, like is low, even when we have the vessel and the willingness to use the reusable cup.
Yeah. Well, that they even actually address that exactly here, which is like a lot of Americans that are on the move want to have a reusable cup with them, and often they don't have it with them, or there is some other barrier for them to be using it that particular time. And so there's sort of a misalignment.
I have a lot of respect for the ways that companies are trying to work on this, including, you know, Starbucks, like, you can have this cup and we'll just have a massive number of them, and then you can bring it back at some point, and we'll have some of these cups out in circulation, kind of like a library model, but for reusable cups.
Yeah.
But they all feel like they are just guessing.
Well, you're right. That Starbucks example is pretty interesting, right? But then you think about what the barriers are for people to buy into that program or just to buy into using any reusable cup. And there's a whole section of that in their table, the data here, ranging from there's no incentive for me to do so. Either it's a price discount for them bringing the cup, or perhaps they don't own one, or they forget to bring it, or they don't like carrying it with them, or even something as simple as they never really thought about reusing a cup. And all of that data has extremely high spread, which means the issue here is not that we know what the problem is. It's that, like, if you took 1,000 people and said, why aren't you using a reusable cup? They would all say a different answer. And that is a problem, because that means that we have to do work now. If you're an industry that you want to train your consumer, your client to do something, but they're all doing it for different reasons, that's very challenging.
Right. And that brings me back to this being a problem, or like a challenge that coffee has a part in, but that requires, a lot more than just the coffee industry. Because for those 1,000 different people with their, 1,000 different reasons for not bringing reusable cups, that's the same reason that they're not bringing reusable bags to the grocery store, maybe, or that they're not, buying secondhand clothing from thrift stores, or maybe these, decisions are totally independent of each other, but it does feel like there's some relationship there, and there's some psychology that I don't, again, think that coffee, even though people really love coffee and have a lot of strong emotions about it, can address for each of those people individually. A company is not going to be able to do this no matter what its size is.
Yeah, so they even say something to sort of address that directly in the paper, which is that if there was a cause, or you somehow told people, even at the point of sale, you just said, hey, by the way, we're going to give you a reusable cup, so next time you come into the cafe, you can use it and whatever. People are prepared then to spend more money, or rather take a lesser discount or whatever, because they understand the reason for why you're asking them to do it. In other words, they make the case that if you educate the consumer, that they are going to buy into this idea, because people generally care about the environment.
Yeah, there's an interesting sentence in this paper where they talk about just the concept of using changes in price to prompt a behavioral change, which in this case is bringing a reusable cup or not. And they say that using that method comes with a risk of diluting someone's intrinsic motivation to act in an environmentally friendly way.
Absolutely.
And they actually cite a paper about reusable bags. And the paper that they cite shows that, whenever you require an incentive or a penalty for someone to adopt a behavior, that doesn't really spill out into other aspects. They were looking if people who use reusable bags were also taking shorter showers and driving less distance and biking more and stuff like that. And they found that people that required some financial motivator to do one thing often didn't carry that behavior into other aspects of their life.
Yeah. Well, then there's this other thing, which is like, it turns out that the most expensive piece of producing a cup of specialty coffee in America is the person who's making it. And then there's like a hierarchy of cost for that cup of coffee to exist at that moment in time. A lot of the money you spend goes to wages and health insurance, hopefully, and all these other things. And then somewhere
it goes to rent.
Right. Rent. So then somewhere in there it goes to like maybe a little bit of it is the coffee cost, but 20 grams of specialty coffee is not really actually that expensive. I mean, it's what, 20 cents in the cup or something. And then there's the price of the cup and blah, blah, blah. So if you start giving a 25-cent discount on a cup of coffee, where do you think that magic money's coming off of? Rent's not changing price. So that money's got to come off of something. And you could say, oh, it's just coming off of profits for the shop. But a lot of these small cafes, even a lot of the bigger specialty coffee shops, they don't make margins that are that big that you could, if everyone did this and they took off 25 cents across the board, that's a pretty significant impact.
It is an outlandish figure. When I read that as the median discount required, I mean, it was like jaw dropping. That is not sustainable. It's like for a coffee business owner to be expected to take on that kind of burden just for the benefit of keeping a cup out of the landfill feels
Yeah.
like, we have missed the plot here.
Exactly. Yeah. So all right. So we're venturing into the summary of this paper, right? So the three there was like three things that I highlighted at the end that really summarize this. They've done a bunch of nice statistics to say which variables affect each other. And I'd encourage the listener to go and read the paper if they're interested in thinking about this reusable cup thing. But basically, it's saying that everyone understands there's sustainability issues and environmental problems with using a cup. And if there was a monetary incentive to use a reusable one, then most people will do that. Pretty straightforward. Turns out that number has to be quite large.
Most people say they will do that.
There's that too. And in conclusion, then, from reading this paper, I think the main conclusion is I don't think that if you take this data set to inform your decision making about reusable cups in a specialty cafe for lots of reasons, that you will actually arrive at a scientifically informed choice for having a monetary discount associated with a reusable cup. I don't think that you actually glean from this that that's a good idea in specialty coffee. And the reason I say that is simply because, as we just mentioned, if you take money away from the product, and we already think specialty coffee is priced too cheap because we're already not putting enough money back to producers, we're not paying the staff enough, et cetera. We're not investing any extra profits in actual sustainability efforts that they could be doing locally or globally. You're just actually depleting the ecosystem of money rather than figuring out creative ways to think bigger than this one little paper cup that's in the cafe. Now, I know the argument. I'm sure, Kim, you've heard this a bunch of times. They say, well, okay, but if you said that about every single decision that you had to make, like, oh, the cup's not the problem, the straw's not the problem, the reusable bag's not the problem, and inevitably you make no efforts whatsoever towards being sustainable, you don't really move the needle. But it's actually not really true. There's one way you can move the needle, which is just spend a lot more money on things. And that's what this paper actually makes the case for in the intro, which is if you spend more money on stuff, then that extra money can go into doing macroscopic global level with high firepower because you got a lot of money. You can then go off and do something sustainable.
I think I agree with your assessment of how useful this paper is. I told my mom I was coming on your podcast, and she asked me what I was going to talk about and what the article was about. And I described it a little bit. And then I concluded by saying that I think that really people who want to bring a reusable cup are going to do it anyway. The money doesn't matter. And people who aren't that motivated to use a reusable cup need so much money to make it worth their while that it's pointless to even try. That's my conclusion about it. And then as to what you said about that, that individual choice thing, I think that we do, and Doran, you mentioned this earlier, we put so much responsibility on the individual to make good choices or right choices, moral choices. It's so much pressure, and it's not just the coffee cup, and it's not just the reusable shopping bag. And then I also see the risk of the backlash to that, where we go to that extreme of, well, none of it matters. If it's like if we're putting too much pressure, then maybe none of it matters, and it's all systemic, and it's all about policy, and it's all top down and institutional. And I don't think that there's a lot of good that comes from that kind of thinking either. So how do we end up somewhere in the middle? And by somewhere, I mean like a lot of different places, depending on the issue and how much leverage a person has for an issue. And that might be like how invested they are. I forget what the term, cause involvement, like what level of cause involvement do they feel with this particular thing? And if this is one for you, then like, that's great. And maybe it is for you sometimes, but you're in an airport and you need coffee and you don't want to bring a reusable cup on a 10-day trip. And so like you use the paper cup, and that's fine.
Let me finish with one other comment, question, observation, et cetera, is that we all attended the SCA Expo in Chicago. When was it? Like last month, right? And it was the most well-attended conference the SCA has hosted. It was a wonderful event. I thought it was highly successful. And one of the things I noticed was that there was these lanyards that had these reusable cups dangling from them. And I unfortunately didn't get my hands on one of those. I would have enjoyed that. In that environment, that reusable cup makes perfect sense because everyone wants you to try a little bit of their coffee, but they're not producing cups of coffee for everyone. They're just producing samples and they distribute out. So sure, you have your little cup that's hanging off your neck. You taste some stuff. It works well in that environment. No one is going to be swinging one of the 32-ounce Stanley tumblers off of their neck as they stroll down to get the brown sugar oat milk iced shaken espresso.
What a flex that would be, though.
Yeah, I think one of the best sentences in this paper is a quote from an article from 1976, because in this case they've supported their hypotheses that people that care about the environment and know that cups are wasteful are a lot more likely to bring a reusable cup. They've established that. And they say that these results are in accordance with these postulates, which state that instantaneous situational rewards
dwarfed
are
by outcomes connected to the topic. I wrote that one down too. Yeah, that was so good.
Give me the quote again. What did they actually say?
Okay, you go ahead, Doran. I just wanted to echo. Yeah, I was so excited. I couldn't stop myself.
Yeah. So they say that instantaneous situational rewards are dwarfed by outcomes connected with the topic. And in this case, an instantaneous situational reward is, oh, my coffee is 15 cents cheaper because I brought my cute cup. That, as a driver for behavioral change, is massively outweighed by, I care about the environment generally, and I want to be more sustainable generally, so I will bring a reusable cup no matter what.
So then the conclusion is what, Kim?
I think the conclusion is that people who use reusable cups are not financially motivated, but they appreciate being recognized.
I think that is exactly they should have written that as the conclusion. That is exactly the conclusion. I was reading this laying in bed last night, thinking about it again. And I don't know what you do. Take a photo of him and pin it to the wall and say, this is a reusable cup guy.
Yeah. I mean, I think you're kind of joking, but it may be just as meaningful or more so to some of those customers as a discount would be. And that again gets to like the 1,000 different reasons that people don't use cups. Like people who do use reusable cups are equally diverse, and they have 1,000 different things that are going to feel like the recognition and the validation that they desire.
Kim, you've said it all. Hopefully you had a good time. We really enjoyed speaking with you about it. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it was great. I've been looking forward to this and excitedly telling people that I get to talk about paper cups on the podcast.